Hi, I'm Jim Munson, the founder of the Brooklyn Roasting Company, and today we're going to show you 3 techniques, tips, tricks to brewing a great cup of coffee at home.
Yesterday, there was sun and there was rain, beauty in the mundane.
The first thing we're going to talk about is freshness and cleanliness. Whenever you make coffee at home, make sure that the coffee that you're using, the roasted coffee, is fresh. Find a local roaster who you trust. Purchase the beans more often rather than less often. I recommend about a week's worth of coffee. We like to use French presses, pour overs, because they're very simple. They don't require lots of electricity. Make sure that brewing equipment is clean. So without further ado, why don't we move on to the second important trick or tip, which is understanding the basics of extraction. Now, extraction, even though it's a 3-syllable word, it's a very simple idea. Basically, it means how much coffee stuff comes out when you add hot water to it. Those are really the 2 basic ingredients, coffee and water. Every coffee recipe, whether you're making French press coffee, pour over coffee, espresso, cold brew, really you just have 2 things. You've got water and coffee. What you do with the coffee and how hot the water is determine the extraction, which is to say how coffee filled the water that you wind up with becomes. The main 2 parameters are grind size, how much you grind the coffee, and how hot the water is, and how long you let it steep. So let's just start with the grind size. In general, remember one simple rule. The finer the grind, the shorter the extraction time. The coarser the grind, the longer the extraction time. So that's easy to remember when you go to a coffee shop and the barista grinds coffee for espresso. It's a very fine grind, really almost like a powder. He only needs about 25-30 seconds to extract that coffee using his espresso machine. On the other hand, when you're at home and you get a nice coarse grind in your French press, this baby right over here, coarse grind, you might let your coffee extract for 3 or 4 or even 5 minutes, depending on your personal taste and preference. So that trade-off, grind size and extraction time, is very important. And for all those methods, we're imagining that your temperature on your water is kind of just off the boil, 203, 205, 206 degrees. So we're taking that as a constant. Let's now move on to the third trick or tip that you'll want to keep in mind as you brew coffee for yourselves at home, and that is the ratio of coffee to water. There's a couple ways to do this. In general, if you're talking to someone who's an expert at the Specialty Coffee Association or a barista who is very fastidious about weighing out all the coffee relative to the amount of water, the general rule of thumb is try to approximate a ratio of 1 to 16. That is to say, 1 dry weight of coffee to 16 fluid weights of water. And you can't really go wrong there. Some people, if you like your coffee a little bit stronger, you use a little bit more coffee relative to the water. If you like it a little bit lighter, use a little bit less coffee. In a French press like this, which we're gonna do an example of, we're gonna keep it very simple. This is roughly a 32-ounce French press. That means we'd use about 2 ounces of coffee. In grams, 1 ounce is about 28.5 grams. So if you're trying to use the metric system and be a little more fancy sounding, you'd say this is 1 liter, this is a 1 liter, which is about 32, 33 ounces. And you'd want to use 2 ounces, which is about 2 times 28, about 57 grams. I like to keep things simple. 2 ounces of coffee to 32 ounces of water. Over time, I've realized that 2 ounces of coffee, 2 ounces of coarse ground coffee for the French press, is about 3/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more. Moreover, with this super fancy grinder in my shop here at the Brooklyn Roasting Company, I know that to fill that to about 3/4 of an inch or an inch takes about 4 seconds on this grinder. I'm gonna load it with fresh roasted coffee because I happen to know the owner of this place, and he's given us some very fresh coffee that was actually roasted and packaged yesterday. Right here, smells delicious. I'm not sure if that camera has a smelling device on it, but if it does, you guys all know that this is really, really fresh coffee. I'm gonna go over here to this grinder that you probably don't have at home. This is an EK43 grinder, which is to say it's about 2,000 bucks. You probably don't have that in your kitchen, but we do here at our lab, where we're constantly tasting and checking quality control of coffees. I know that on this grinder, and I preset it to a coarse grind, that if I press this button for about 3.5, 4 seconds, I'm gonna get between 3/4 of an inch and 1 inch in the bottom. At home, doesn't matter, using a little blade, brawn grinder, or Bodum grinder, or a fancier burr grinder. However you get that 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch, that's about right. Now, here we go. 2, 3, 4, shut it off, shake it a little bit. Does that look like about 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch? I think it does. I think it's almost perfect. That's because I do this all the time. I'm in the coffee business, I'm a coffee expert, plus I love coffee and I'm drinking it every single morning. Now this baby, you have at home probably a tea kettle or some other way, a water heater, some other way to get coffee to the boil. We have this handy dandy Marco water heater, which keeps about 1.5 gallons, 2 gallons of water always at a boil after going through small micron filtration. That is to say, this is a really nice way to get your water. I press this button and it automatically dispenses water right off the boil. And in this case, it's dispensing about 600 milliliters. I'll press, it'll bubble up. Some people like to stir the coffee at this point, and I want to show you what fresh roasted coffee looks like as it's brewing. See all this space? That's fresh coffee blooming. Lots of carbon dioxide is coming off of it. And it's nice to stir the coffee at this point. One of the fun things about coffee is everybody has personal preferences. It shouldn't be that complicated. The definition of something simple is just add water. The truth is, with coffee, you just add water. So we don't need to make it too complicated. You can stir with a spoon, you can stir with a wooden stick. And now you see, we filled the water right up to the band, put about 1 inch. That's about 32 ounces of water, about 2 ounces of coffee. That's that 1:16 ratio that we like to at least begin with. I seat the French press with the strainer part up front near the spout. I just put it right down here. There it's seated. I depress the plunger just a little bit for about 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and then I lift it back up. All the coffee that naturally floats because of the carbon dioxide has now been submerged in water and lifted back up. You don't need to do a lot more stirring than that. At this point, you're watching your clock or you're thinking to yourself, it's early in the morning, I haven't had my coffee. I don't really want to use a stopwatch and a timer. I don't really want to use a digital scale to measure out how much. I do this all the time. I don't mind a little variation in my coffee. If I'm brewing for a group of professionals, maybe I do start my stopwatch and make sure that it's exactly 3 minutes and 45 seconds or 4 minutes. Maybe I do measure out exactly 2 ounces, or if I'm using a metric digital scale, exactly 57 grams. Maybe I even measure out exactly 32 ounces of water, or 1 liter, 1,000 milliliters, maybe a little less. But here, for our purposes, we're doing things by taste. We're trusting our own senses, our own ability to make a good cup of coffee. And that's part of the fun of making coffee at home, is to experiment. Have fun. Once you understand the ratio and the idea of extraction, finer grinds, longer times, once you understand the importance of using clean equipment, fresh roasted coffee, freshly ground coffee, then you can tinker and tailor the coffee to what you prefer and the taste profile that you most like. The French press is a wonderful way to brew a very rich cup of coffee. If you talk to 10 coffee experts, they'll probably tell you that they prefer French presses, sometimes for bigger bodied or darker roasted coffees, because you get a little bit more body through the metal screen. If you're brewing a lighter roasted coffee or a lighter bodied coffee, for instance, an East African coffee, maybe a washed Ethiopian or a natural processed Ethiopian, you might prefer to use a pour over, which uses a paper filter or some other finer filter that doesn't let quite as much of the coffee's body through. I think it's been about 4 minutes, maybe a little bit more. I'm going to press this all the way down, and voila. While the coffee was brewing, I hopefully was able to communicate 3 nice tips that anyone can employ at home and enjoy a good cup of coffee, which I suspect resides right here in this pot. Remember what they are. The first one, clean equipment, fresh roasted coffee, and freshly ground coffee. Number 2, remember the basics of extraction. And this ties into number 3, which is experiment once you understand that. The basis of extraction is grind size is inversely proportional to brewing time. The finer the grind, the shorter the time. The coarser the grind, the longer the brew time. Once you understand that, you can play with things and brew a coffee that's delicious every time at home. So now that we've ground the coffee, brewed it, waited 4 minutes, it's time to do what's the most fun. We're going to enjoy it. I'm going to pour a nice cup of coffee, and that's delicious. Thanks for joining me. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.